Welcome to Military Analytics. Undoubtedly, Bakhmut is the place where the Ukrainian war took place most intensely. Bakhmut has now become a matter of life and death for both countries, and whoever loses here will be taking a big hit for this war. The Russian army continues its offensive operations in Bakhmut, but the offensive potential is decreasing day by day. The Russian army is now losing its offensive potential in and around Bakhmut since the Ukrainian armed forces doubled the number of troops and military equipment in Bakhmut. Attempts by the Russian army to attack have been fruitless. Russian troops are trapped on the outskirts of Bakhmut. In addition, the Russian army carries out unsuccessful attacks in Avdiivka, another important city like Bakhmut, over the past week. The Russian army has attempted around 1,000 attacks in 5 directions in and around Bakhmut. However, these efforts of the Russian army were inconclusive. The Ukrainian army succeeded in repelling about 90% of the Russian attacks. Only a few of the Russian missile and drone attacks were successful. In particular, the Ukrainian troops deployed U.S. HIMARS troops around Bakhmut with their Western third-generation tanks, air defense systems, and new ultra-range missiles. In the hottest clashes in Bakhmut the other day, the Ukrainian army destroyed 6 Russian arsenals in one night. In this success, the US-made HIMARS missiles had a great advantage. Still, the Russian army is desperately continuing its armed aggression against Ukraine, focusing its main efforts on attempts to completely control the Donetsk and Luhansk regions within its administrative borders. The Russian army continues to conduct defensive operations in the Lyman, Bakhmut, Avdiivka, Marinka and Shakhtarsk directions. The fiercest clashes continued for Bakhmut and in the direction of Avdiivka. The Russian army continues to use its usual tactics of disturbing the civilian population and bombing residential areas and critical infrastructure facilities. So what about the front lines? During the past day, the Russian army launched 4 missile strikes, 24 airstrikes and more than 30 strikes. But Ukrainian air defense units repelled most of these attacks, according to the daughter of the Ukrainian General Staff. The Russian leadership continues to use the infrastructure of the Republic of Belarus to train its troops. The Russians maintain their military presence in the border regions. During the past day, the Russian army destroyed 3 settlements in the Chernihiv region, 5 settlements in the Sumy region. It bombed 7 residential areas in the Kharkiv region in the Kupiansk and Lyman directions. The Russian army continues its attempts to break through the defenses of the Ukrainian troops. The Russian army conducted unsuccessful offensive operations in 4 residential areas near Lyman, 5 settlements in the Kharkiv region, 2 settlements in the Luhansk region, and 3 settlements in the Donetsk region came under Russian artillery fire in the direction of Bakhmut. The Russian army continues to attack, but the offensive is losing its potential. The Russian army does not stop trying to capture the city, losing a significant amount of manpower, weapons and military equipment. Ukrainian defense units repulsed numerous attacks of the Russian army, and the northern parts of Orikhovo, Vasilivka, Hryhorivka and Bakhmut came under Russian fire around the clock in the directions of Avdiivka, Marinka and Shakhtarsk. The Russian army attacked in the settlements of Novo Bakhmutka, Krasnohorivka, Avdiivka, Severny, Pervomaysky, Marinka and Pobeda, but without success. 9 settlements in the Donetsk region, including Avdiivka and Volodar, came under Russian fire. Russian troops hold the defense in the Zaporizhia and Kherson directions. Settlements close to the contact line, especially Novy Hill in the Donetsk region. 8 settlements in the Zaporizhia region and the cities of Antonivka and Kherson in the Kherson region were exposed to Russian attacks. But the Ukrainian defense units could not open the steel curtain over the past day. The Ukrainian air forces carried out 5 attacks on Russian army clusters, and missile and artillery units struck an ammunition depot, 2 anti-aircraft missile systems, a radar station, and another important Russian object. It is not clear how many Russian soldiers died in the attacks of the Ukrainian army. And the Russian Defense Ministry still has not made a statement on the subject. The devastated city of Bakhmut has long been the focal point of the war, as Russian forces seek to reinvigorate their military operations in the east. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky visited the front line in Bakhmut, where fighting has raged for months. His visit came as Russian forces launched a series of attacks on Ukrainian cities near Kiev and in Zaporizhia. The Ukrainian army said it shot down 16 Russian army drones, but 5 of them hit targets. 8 civilians lost their lives as a result of the attacks. 7 civilians were killed in the attack on student dormitories in Rizikov. Then a rocket hit an apartment block in the southeastern city of Zaporizhia, killing 1 person and injuring 25. Local leaders said the death toll could rise. While denouncing Russia's attacks on civilians, President Zelensky also visited the Eastern Front, where Ukrainian forces have been keeping Russia out for more than 7 months. Zelensky last visited the area in December. Footage released by the presidential office showed him giving medals to war-weary soldiers in an old industrial warehouse. Zelensky said he was honored to be in Donbass in eastern Ukraine and to reward, thank, and shake hands with the heroic Ukrainian soldiers, adding that the Bakhmut defense would never give up. So why is Bakhmut important to Russia and Ukraine? UK military intelligence said a Ukrainian counterattack west of Bakhmut would relieve pressure on the main supply route to the city, and the Russian attack on the city could lose the limited momentum it had. Clashes continue around the city center, and the Ukrainian defense is at risk of being encircled from the north and south. The battle for Bakhmut reaches a critical point as Russian forces are sending assault troops on suicide missions, seizing land inch by inch and closing the city like a vice as early as January. Ukrainian commanders said the city was not strategically important. In the last 2 weeks, they have changed their minds, rejecting the idea of a pullback even as the losses increase. Generals say Bakhmut is a key element in Russia's efforts to weaken its military ahead of a critical Ukrainian offensive. Using fresh Western-trained troops and modern equipment supplied by the United States and its allies, the armed forces of Ukraine described the defense of Bakhmut this week as the key to the stability of the defense of the entire front. Wave after wave of Russian soldiers are thrown into the chaos of war without any synchronized coordination and direction. Both sides suffer heavy casualties, but Ukraine says the odds are largely in their favor. Soldiers fighting in Bakhmut this week described the fierce urban battle as a grueling effort against troops from the Wagner PMC group, which led Russia's offensive line there, with troops mostly recruited from Russian prisons. The Bakhmut River, which divides the city in two, is now the line between the Russian and Ukrainian positions. Russian troops crossed the river south this week, threatening Ukraine's control of the city center, while the Ukrainians were digging improvised trenches next to housing blocks damaged by weeks of shelling. They detonated Russian positions with mortars and rocket-propelled grenades. Both sides are short of ammo. Western officials say that while Ukraine procured shells ahead of its planned offensive, Russia was also hampered by low artillery stockpiles. Ukraine's armed forces in eastern Ukraine said Russia is currently firing 20,000 rounds a day along the front line, a third of what it was just a few weeks ago. Doctors of the Ukrainian army go to Bakhmut every 2 days in the US-made DEM-113 armored personnel carrier. There was only one reliable route to the city, a lifeline through which troops and supplies ran through the village of Ivanovsky. Ukraine is making repairs under Russian fire, but it is now a dirt road after constant shelling by Russian forces that moved within a mile of the highway. When it rains, the roads become nearly impassable, a muddy swamp that only vehicles like the M1 and M3 can traverse. On each trip, they search the bombed-out buildings at the western end of Bakhmut and drag out their comrades, many of them wounded and some dead. Information from the front indicates that Russian troops of the Wagner PMC group carried out attacks without artillery or air support and were advancing despite being beaten by Ukrainian tanks and mortars with only Kalashnikov rifles from the north and south. Russia is trying a pincer movement that will trap the Ukrainian defenders of Bakhmut inside the city. It heads northwest towards Shahsavar, a town that faces Bakhmut and is often seen as a second line of defense should Bakhmut fall. A unit from Ukraine's 17th Tank Brigade is trying to stop this offensive by taking a position 800 yards from the Russians who are attacking an important road to Bakhmut. Wagner's troops move along the rows of trees, continuing to advance, even when under fire. The fight for Bakhmut is one of the 3 major wars in eastern Ukraine. In the south, Russia largely stalled in its move to take Vologda. It moves north, advanced 90 tanks, armored personnel carriers, and mobiles troops trained for mechanized advance towards the town of Lyman, where fierce fighting is raging. If Ukraine can launch a successful counterattack and drive the Russians out of Bakhmut, more and more bitter wars are likely ahead. After all, we should not think that this war will end in Bakhmut. Amid allegations that Russia is preparing for something much bigger, the Russian military is far from the beginning of the war. It is not known what the following days will show us, But the current trend is that the Bakhmut war will not end soon. Generals in the Russian army are living the hardest days of their lives because the Russian army is suffering a historic defeat. The Putin administration blames Russian generals for this defeat. Many top generals have been dismissed. The Russian people no longer respect the generals. Russian generals are also in a very bad situation on the battlefield. The Ukrainian army is giving Russian generals hell. Russian soldiers don't listen to their commander's orders, and Russian generals risk more than anyone else in this war. The Ukrainian army is targeting Russian generals with strategic operations. Japanese intelligence, in cooperation with the US and Europe, has conducted research on the generals killed in the Russian army. According to these investigations, 20 generals are reported to have died in the Russian army. The death of 20 generals in war is one of the biggest indicators of how big a defeat the Russian army has suffered in Ukraine. The situation is completely different. Ukrainian generals are very much loved by the people. All generals work heroically. One of the most beloved Ukrainian generals is Major General Dmytro Marchenko. Marchenko's statements today have given the Ukrainian people even more hope for independence. Marchenko gave information about the current state of the war on many fronts. Marchenko claimed that the Russian army has been preparing for this war for 10 years. The growing demand of the Ukrainian people for independence frightened Putin. Putin had been working on all military plans to invade Ukraine for many years. Putin was also spreading propaganda against the Ukrainian people. As a result of this propaganda, he wanted the Ukrainian people to surrender to Russia. According to Marchenko, one of Putin's biggest defeats was the resistance of the Ukrainian people. Putin thought that there would be no resistance in southern Ukraine and that the Ukrainian people would welcome the Russian troops with joy. But the Ukrainian people showed a historic resistance and inflicted a heavy defeat on the Russian army. Marchenko said that the Ukrainian population constantly provided information about the location of Russian troops in the region. As a result, the Ukrainian army's artillery organized operations against critical targets of the Russian army. General Marchenko said that he thinks that God's help is also with Ukraine because many times the Russian army got stuck in natural obstacles. Ukraine has many rivers and mountains. The Russian army had great difficulty in crossing these geographical obstacles. Ukrainian generals took this opportunity very well. The Russian army was not allowed to dominate the western bank of the Dnipro River. Ukrainian soldiers dragged the Russian army to the eastern bank of this river, creating a natural barrier. This prevented the Russian army from land attacks, but the Ukrainian army was very lucky in this respect. One of the Ukrainian army's most powerful munitions was the javelin. These systems, which can be carried on the shoulder by a soldier, launch laser-guided missiles. The warhead of these missiles causes a huge explosion on impact with a range of about 5,000 meters. The javelin missiles are very successful in destroying Russian tanks. The Ukrainian army positioned on the west bank of the river fired at the Russian army with javelin missiles several times. As a result of these operations, the Russian army suffered heavy losses. HIMARS missiles and Bayraktar drones were also used extensively during these operations. Using these advanced weapons, the Ukrainian army carried out operations against ammunition depots and military bases of the Russian army. But the ammunition of the Ukrainian army was not enough to resist the Russian army. Ukrainian general used all ammunition very carefully and constantly targeted Russian ammunition. The Ukrainian army captured Russian ammunition on many fronts and used Russian weapons to fight. But Ukraine needs more. General Marchenko said Ukraine is a shield of Europe. It defends Europe. And Putin is like a dog trying to meat for the first time. He won't just stop. He will do everything to get more and more meat. He won't stop if he gets Ukraine. So it's time for us to come together and fight to repel him. Together we have the people and the will to fight. We just need the equipment. We just need help. Give me a sword and a shield. I will fight. Western countries are preparing to send more aid to Ukraine, especially after the delivery of Leopard 2 tanks and Patriot air defense systems to Ukraine. The course of the war is expected to change completely with these modern weapons. The Ukrainian army could completely end the occupation of the Russian army. The Ukrainian army is currently preparing for a comprehensive liberation operation. However, new weapons are expected to be sent for this operation. The support of NATO members to Ukraine at this time is very important. The whole world is waiting for support from NATO countries after Marchenko said that they were preparing for a major operation to make the Russian army fully. He said something else very important: we just need to force and break them to make them flee even from the Crimean Peninsula. Marchenko's statement caused a great stir among the Ukrainian people. The struggle for the liberation of Crimea occupied in Russia by 2014 continues. Ukrainian authorities say that everything will be done to liberate Crimea. Zelensky also made a statement on this issue. This war started in Crimea. It will end in Crimea. Zelensky's statement has become a slogan in Ukraine. Ukrainian people want Crimea to be liberated, and liberation of the city could lead to the fall of Putin's power in Russia because Crimea is considered one of Putin's biggest victories. If Russia is defeated there, Putin's reputation will suffer a huge loss. This defeat could spell the end of Putin's rule. Putin is increasing security measures in Crimea, but the Kremlin has no hope anymore. The Ukrainian army is marching to victory step by step. Russian forces made another attempt to undercut the whole Bakhmut group by advancing from the south. Their goal was to move closer to the intersection and establish total fire control over the Ivanovsky highway. However, Ukrainians deployed a highly explosive 90-meter line charge and closed the axis of advance with fire. Last time I told you that Russian forces had accumulated a lot of artillery systems within 10 kilometers of Bakhmut in order to fire for effect and help Wagner forces to capture Ukrainian positions. I also told you that due to the overwhelming fire and assaults, Ukrainians withdrew from the central part of the city. The freshest reports revealed another reason why Ukrainians took a decision to step back. After Russian forces advanced near the market, Ukrainian troops in the high-rise buildings faced a very difficult situation. They were under fire control of the snipers located in the high-rise buildings on the other side of the river, and they had to hold off Russian assaults from the north and south. Despite the fact that the area under their control was small, the front line around this group was actually quite long and required a lot of troops to hold it. Russian forces started exploiting the fact that the concentration of Ukrainian forces in this small salient was high and moved in their flamethrower systems to burn the whole area down. The footage that was released today shows how Russians targeted the high-rise buildings and shelled the whole Komarovka area. After stepping back, this Ukrainian group shortened the front line under their responsibility by 3 times and re-established a close connection to the rear. But Russian forces are not the only ones who are using incendiary weapons. Yesterday, Wagner forces once again tried to advance from the south and cut off the Ivanovsky highway, as seen from various videos. Ukrainians are continuously driving through the area in order to stop further advancement. Ukrainians drove a mine-clearing vehicle called Meteorite from behind the high-rise buildings, launched a line charge, and detonated, burning the whole area. Other footage from the southern part of the region suggests that Russians have finally advanced towards the stadium. Ukrainian 3rd Assault Brigade recently released footage showing how they are defending against a Russian assault right next to the stadium. Ukrainians were standing on the intersection of Shiroko and Bakhmutka streets and firing south in the northern part of the region. The situation remains stable, and also after Russian forces withdrew, atoms had been pushed from the tree lines. Ukrainian forces continue to use the home of a highway to deliver supplies. That is why Russians increase their fire on the western part of the region. Fresh footage shows how Russian rocket falls right in front of the Ukrainian group in this region. Fortunately, this is not the first time such rockets failed to detonate because a noticeable portion of Russian shells are so old that they fail to detonate. However, Russians are compensated with the number of shells. Ukrainian soldiers from the 1st Border Detachment said that they never felt like Wagner forces reduced the rate of shelling even once. The cannonade hardly ever sees this maximum for several hours, and it can be seen from the buildings in the background. These blocks are located on the outer edge of the city, yet still there is not even one window with unshattered glass inside. Parts of the city are always burning, but some civilians still choose to stay. Overall, Russian forces did not manage to cut off Ukrainian supplies from the south, and the supplies also continue coming from the north. So the threat of encirclement continues to be low. Nonetheless, Ukrainians were pushed out from their positions along the river, and they were pushed closer to the city center. Some say that the Ukrainians are not planning on holding on to this sector at any cost. It's been speculated that they are preparing the defense line along the railways, and once they finish, they will allow the front line to shift westward. In the meantime, the Ukrainian president once again reassured that the moment the situation in Bakhmut stops playing in favor of Ukrainians, they would for sure withdraw from the city, which is not impossible given that they have recently secured the roads for moving equipment and have tunnels for rotation of personnel.